Welcome, bienvenue, welcome once again to another Property Matters. One of a whole suite, a barrage, you might say, of property shows which Hamish has commanded me to put together with him. And we talk about all manner of topics. Today's topic is specifically deals with how people disport themselves when criticism goes public. All about keeping it professional. And to start us off, as is traditional, Hamish, take it away, please.
Today we've got a very, very sort of complex subject to discuss, and I think probably an intellectual subject which would require several hours of discussion under normal conditions. All we try and do with our podcast is create an awareness in people's minds of what is going on within the property industry. Now, today's subject is very much of what goes on within society today. And I think if I was asked as to who I would like to sort of bring into a conversation of this nature, the Silas who joins us today is probably one of those people. In fact, probably the only person I really know at this moment who could actually sort of go through this level of discussion, because it's fortunate that through meeting Silas, which I did over a year ago now, he brought me to the attention of a certain character called Dr. David Hawkins. And now, if you haven't read anything intellectual for a while, have a little bash at Power versus Force, because it is very, very enlightening in terms of what it brings out in our lives. I'm currently reading a book, which is this particular one here. I don't know if you can read, where it's Stoic Empathy, that is very deep and very intellectual, but it does actually combine together the way I think we should be living our lives, but certainly are not doing. So a little dose of Dr. David Hawkins, a little dose of the author Sherman Cruz. Fascinating, actually, with her background, where she actually comes from. Even the introduction is well worth reading, just to see why she has come up with a solution. Why is it that today, and it's not just in property matters, it's throughout society, that we have this way of instead of what we're doing, instead of discussing with each other, we seem to be decrying each other in terms of our sort of conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Battle. There's wars going on throughout the sort of world. There's all sorts of weird things going on in our streets every day. What is it that brings this disparity? And what we would actually sort of find, I should say, actually, both of those two topics I just spoke about, that the reading and the listening to of either Stoic Empathy or Dr. David Hawkins, it will only appeal to less than 20% of society. Why? Because only 20% of society, if we're lucky, can get on with each other. The rest, sadly, and when we actually speak, I'll bring this out in the conversation in due course, but when we speak with each other, we rather forget that we aren't speaking to that 20%. Us speaking here together, we are within that group, I would suggest.
There's the book to which Hamish has made reference. It is available on Amazon. Other sources are available. Hamish, I have to bring Silas into the picture. Silas, apparently you're a fine, upstanding gent with an ethical backbone. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, that's very kind of you, gentlemen, to say. I mean, I think I always try to strive to treat people with a certain amount of respect, and I do find that the way that society has gone, particularly with the advent of social media, people are prepared to say things in an online forum that they're perhaps not prepared to say face to face with somebody now, particularly along the lines of criticizing somebody's worldview or point of view. I find that quite a shocking factor of things that have unfolded in today's society. And I will hold my hand up. I can be guilty of it myself. But I think it's what's happened as we've removed ourselves from that personal element of talking face to face to talking through a computer screen. And I think that's something that we need to address with care and respect for fellow human beings.
if I could just quickly jump in there myself and say, until relatively recently, I'd never met Hamish or your good self in the flesh, but we still managed to disport ourselves with a degree, a modicum of decorum, intelligence, emotional intelligence at that, and support. And never once did I feel the need to pull down either of you or anyone else that I met through this medium. So I reject, I'm afraid, the fact that it's through the electronic medium. What I do agree with you is, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, Silas, it's to do with the ridiculously fast, I'm sounding very old when I say this, way in which things move ahead, and the desperate need for instant gratification. That if people don't do the things we ask them to do within 10 seconds of asking them, suddenly we have to characterize them as indolent or unsupportive.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, do you think that's the nature of the medium of social media, that it all happens very quickly?
I think that there's certainly an element of that in terms of the response to the initial stimulus, whatever that might be, whether it's a request or a question or something of that nature. I am probably more in the camp of taking my time to think things through, or unless it's something that I particularly know well. But also, I think the ability to have an open mind about topics that we may not be experts in. One of my favorite sayings is, excuse my ignorance, but what do you mean by that? Because what I can understand from a certain topic might be totally different from somebody else's understanding. And I think having that broad open mind and being civil is a way to not only get somebody on side, but also to expand your own worldview.
So, Hamish, this topic, is this specifically about civility in business relations, or are you looking wider than that, that the way in which we deal with each other as humans should be to promote each other and lift each other up, all tides rising, all ships sort of thing?
I don't think you can separate the two, to be perfectly honest. Wherever I am what I am, and I do like to be that way. And if I sort of see there's a need to change something, I make an effort to try and change that. And it tends not to be for my specific benefit, because I'm quite happy to sort of do things the way I do things. But there are better ways, and sometimes, and as Silas sort of indicated as well, it is possible every now and again, when somebody cuts you up and as you're driving along, you might want to kill them, or say that you don't really mean that. And basically you can actually sort of overcome that situation. But there are situations like that where you think on the spot, that sort of knee-jerk sort of type of reaction. However, it's very, very important. And I think when groups of people need to work together to achieve, it becomes much more relevant. And we've got a scenario here. I mean, if we were to go and ask 100 people what they thought about conveyancing, probably more than 50% would say what the hell are you talking about. But those that were to answer us would all give us different answers. But within a conveyancing scenario, we need, when you actually sort of think about how many people are seriously involved professionally and should be acting in a professional manner, and we want to do the best for those, we have the buyer and the seller at each end of the equation. However, we've got the solicitor helping the seller. We have a solicitor helping the buyer. So we're already up to sort of 4 people without going anywhere. We have an estate agent who comes in here. Now, without the estate agents and without the conveyancers, we wouldn't go anywhere, because we need it all sewn up legally, because otherwise we cannot have we cannot have legal ownership without that legal intervention. So everybody needs to be getting on with each other. So what is the point of slating each other within that particular sort of process? There are so many ways that people can obtain a local authority search. Which is the best way? I'm seriously biased, because if somebody personally knows a particular council in a council area, I think that's probably the best way. But is that the way that it's being handled? 80% of the population, interestingly enough, are not handling it that way. Less than 80% of the population are handling it that way. They prefer to go down a corporate or a factory sort of style of route, which is to do with the mass sort of volume, getting the mass volume through, rather than the individuals that we spoke about, the buyer and the seller. And of course, within that, as we say, the sort of corporate method, there are other providers outside of the big corporates, as the smaller companies, some really, really good ones. But what it is, it really doesn't matter. We need to communicate to each other. And if you can't communicate, that's one of the advantages of actually dealing with the smaller company, because you're more likely to be able to speak to the person you want to speak to. But that's not what we're speaking about in this particular sort of topic in a way. It's trying to actually say, I'm not so sure that I don't understand what he said. And what Silas said about the whole thing is a marvelous, marvelous response to anything anybody says. Even if we do understand what they've said, if we stop, let's not stopping them in their tracks, but ask them to perhaps explain it another way.
Yes, I think defining your terms is very important in any kind of communication with humans. But I often find people going off half-cock without all of the information, casting aspersions, making decisions, changing direction, and changing policy without having gathered everything. I mean, case in point, the cladding matters, the whole business with Royal Artillery Keys. No, the relevant people in councils have made decisions without having taken into account all of the information. Silas, it's a crazy situation, surely.
It is, and one of the things I want to say in terms of being a student of human psychology, if you like, one of the biggest things that people tie to, of course, is their identity. So to track back to what Hamish was saying earlier about you have this conveyancer, estate agent disparity. Well, the conveyancer will say, well, I am a conveyancer, you don't understand. Okay, well, help me understand. What are the main problems that you're faced with that we can help resolve earlier in the process, perhaps from an estate agent's point of view, that will help you do your job a lot faster and easier. But it's when people tie that identity to superiority complex, for example, and then being unwilling to communicate in a way that is effective to help people resolve a mutual situation, which is what home buying and selling is. And I think the other thing is that is so glaringly obvious here from a number of topics that you guys tackle on these various podcasts is the unwillingness of people to put themselves in the shoes of another. So you mentioned cladding matters. We've got Steve there living in a property that is potentially could go up in smoke, in an instant. And if the councillors or the insurance companies or the developers who are blocking the plans to resolve these issues were living in that same property in Steve's place, there would be a very different reaction to resolving this issue. Now, from a humanitarian aspect, you would expect it to be resolved very quickly because, who wants somebody living in a tinderbox and the threat to life? But there are commercial interests that are being put above the interests of life. And that to me is untenable. It's unconscionable. So where is the threshold in terms of morals and ethics in exactly the conversation that we're addressing here today? I think that's something that is it's easy to talk about, but unless you're in that position, of course, very difficult to live by.
As an autistic gentleman, I try and live a lot of my life through the laws of logic. And sometimes that can come across as very brusque and direct, but it's always very truthful. And it's me trying to hold up a mirror to what is really going on around. Now, if you just followed the laws of logic, at least you'd be living with integrity, and at least you'd be saying what you're going to do, and then doing it, and then saying you've done it, which to me is the ideal way of working. But it seems to me, Hamish, that so many people are willing to cast stones, epithets, and cast aspersions on people without having communicated with them effectively.
I think this is one of the struggles, and it's rather amusing in a way if you look at it from one particular perspective. And LinkedIn is probably an interesting concept to be able to sort of use about this.
Of
because
course,
people will come on to sort of LinkedIn and they use their LinkedIn ads, and all of a sudden you get this straight into your face, somebody trying to sell you something who you've never met before. You don't understand what the heck they're talking about. If you did, you may be interested in the conversation, but because you've never met them or discussed it or know what the heck it's about, but it comes sort of straight at you. And it's much the same sort of thing as Silas was saying sort of earlier, that we have situations now which enable us to communicate very, very quickly, almost anonymously. And so there's a lot of anonymous stuff that actually sort of goes on.
I keep banging on about a very similar topic. I think people try and close far too quickly on LinkedIn. They almost introduce, here's my name. Oh, by the way, would you like to buy my Okikoki 2000? And I think instead of that, they need to create a veneer of trust, a veneer of belief, so that they believe they know what each other stands for and where they sit before you start talking about something business orientated. Otherwise, just from a sales perspective, you lose the sale before it's even got to a point where it could be a sale. You know, relationships need to be built. You don't need to know each other's inside leg measurement, but what you do need to know is, do you represent yourself as someone true with integrity and consistency? And I fear, and my inbox on LinkedIn is a test to this, I get approached all day and every day by people trying to sell me LinkedIn services. It's like, spend a few minutes to get to know the people you're trying to approach. And this, Hamish, I think you could probably cover this across the board. It doesn't have to be just on LinkedIn. In real world, you wouldn't walk up to someone in a supermarket and say, would you like to use our conveyancing search services to help you buy that? No, you wouldn't do that. That would be ridiculous behavior.
Not so sure. You're quite right. You're quite right. And the other element, which a lot of people forget about as well, some of us are fussy about who we want to deal with. There was a time when I'd accept work from anybody because it was work, and it just seemed to me that it was contributing to my business. What I didn't understand was the level that they were looking at compared to the level I was looking at, because there are this disparity of sort of levels at which people are approaching each other. And this is why, from a corporate perspective, if you've got mass volumes, it would be absolutely ideal to be able to integrate with a network like we have with the IPSO sort of type of sort of program, which we'll hear more about tomorrow, which would be quite interesting. However, what is actually sort of important is that we can embrace with each other, because we are all different, fortunately, because otherwise we'd be dead, because we're invaded by all sorts of atrocities. Some of them happen to be war, some of them are sort of man-made, and also there's various diseases that come about. So if we weren't all different, we'd all be dead. So we are all different for a good reason, but we all have different levels of consciousness too. From a tribal perspective, ownership of land is absolutely vital in Central Africa. So it is actually sort of run or fight in that particular environment.
Yeah.
And that's the way however, hopefully we're not like that. But it seems from a day-to-day process, when you look on LinkedIn, when you look on various matters that do come across, they do come across a bit over serious on occasion. You think back, well, if somebody just asked, as Silas said, what was your journey in your moccasins like to bring you to this particular sort of place?
Well, as I always say, if you want to know how someone really feels, take a walk in someone else's shoes for a mile or so. That way, you're a mile away from them and you've got their shoes. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Thank you so much, Silas, for bringing a degree of integrity to today's proceedings, and Hamish Clay for having set the thing up in the first place. It is a show all about trying to acquaint with ideas without teaching you, more to wake you up to the idea that some things that often aren't discussed should be. Until next week, please try and keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars and look after that mental health. Until next time, bye-bye.